The Roman Empire was not merely a collection of marble temples and paved roads. It was a vast, cold machine designed to process human existence into imperial fuel. In the year AD 67, that machine received a specific order from the highest office in the world. Emperor Nero did not want a slave, a soldier, or a worker. He wanted a resurrection. He found a boy named Sporus and handed him to the physicians of the Palatine Hill. What followed was not an act of sudden madness, but a methodical, clinical, and legal dismantling of a human being. This is the story of how an empire used its medical expertise, its administrative ledgers, and its terrifying silence to turn a living child into a ghost in the flesh. The scalpels are sharp. The ledgers are open. The nightmare is now official policy. The air inside the Imperial wing of the Palatine Hill is heavy. It carries the metallic scent of fresh blood. A polished bronze blade taps softly against a basin of pale stone. The physicians scrub their fingers with practiced calm. These men are not here to preserve a life. They are here to edit one. They are here to dismantle a human body and rebuild it according to a royal command. On a marble slab at the center of the room, a young boy lies stretched out. He is a piece of provincial cargo purchased from a market. To the Roman state, he is not a child. He is raw material. He is a biological blank page waiting for a master to write a new function across his skin. The surgeons in the room are the best in the known world. Many have traveled from Alexandria, the heart of ancient medicine. They are not crude butchers. They are technicians of the human frame. They follow the strict surgical doctrines of men like Celsus. They know that a true surgeon must have a hand that does not tremble. He must have a mind so disciplined that he can ignore the screaming of his patient. He must focus only on the perfect execution of the cut. The room around them is prepared with clinical efficiency. Tall olive oil lamps burn along the walls. Polished silver mirrors catch the firelight and throw it directly onto the operating table. The room smells of heated metal and the sharp bite of vinegar used to clean the surfaces. Guards strip the boy bare. They lift him onto the wooden platform. They cinch thick leather straps around his wrists and ankles. The chief physician approaches with a sea sponge soaked in a mixture of mandragora root and concentrated opium. They press it against the boy's nose and mouth. The narcotics dull the edges of his fear, but they cannot stop the deeper nerves from firing. The first incision is made. The bronze edge slides through the skin. Blood runs across the table and spills onto the stone tiles below. Slaves stand in the corners with buckets of boiling water and fresh sponges. The castration is not a messy act of violence. It is a methodical, almost reverent dissection. The surgeons locate the major arteries. They clamp them shut with iron forceps. They sever the tissue with practiced strokes. They pass heated metal discs over the open wounds. This is the cauterization. The glowing bronze fuses the vessels in an instant. White smoke rises from the wound and curls toward the ceiling. The chamber fills with the smell of burning fat and scorched blood. The boy thrashes against the leather straps until the skin around his forearms splits open. He screams into the sponge. The physicians do not look at his face. They study the surgical edges. They confirm the bleeding has stopped. They pack the deep cavity with strips of lint soaked in sour wine and crushed honey. A clerk standing at the doorway records the time of completion on a wax-coated scroll. The male body has been administratively erased. In the eyes of the law, the boy who entered the room no longer exists. A name has been crossed out in an inventory ledger. A new category of property has been created. The surgeons wash their hands. The guards unbuckle the straps. The procedure is a success. The foundation of Nero's private nightmare has been laid. The boy is left to bleed and tremble in the dark, denied the mercy of death. He is now a ghost in the flesh, waiting for the next stage of his destruction. Stay with us till the end for valuable insight. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. The boy lay in a darkened recovery chamber for weeks. In the ancient world, surgery was only half the battle. Sepsis was the silent assassin that waited in the shadows of every hospital wing. Slaves changed his bandages at every sunrise. They watched his forehead for the heat of a fever that would signal the end. But the Empire's medical machine was too efficient to let its new project die so easily. The torn edges of the surgical wound slowly fused into a thick band of scar tissue. The sharp, white-hot pain of the knife eventually dulled into a constant, throbbing ache, a background noise that would stay with him for the rest of his life. However, the physical reconstruction was merely the foundation. To truly satisfy the Emperor's delusion, the boy's mind had to be flayed. Calvia Crispinilla entered the chamber. She was a noblewoman of immense rank and the Imperial supervisor of vices. Her job was to manage the darkest cravings of the ruler. Now, she was the lead architect of a new person. She moved her belongings into the boy's quarters and began the methodical demolition of his identity. She established the first law immediately. The name Sporus was buried. Any slave or guard who spoke that name in the boy's hearing received 50 lashes. The name was gone. The past was gone. Calvia began the process of rewiring his physical mechanic. A boy raised in the slave pen's walks with a long, open stride. Calvia carried a slim wooden rod to correct this. Whenever his gait slipped back into something masculine, she struck him sharply behind the knees. She drilled him for hours until he adopted the constrained, floating steps of a Roman noblewoman. She corrected the position of his hands. She adjusted the tilt of his head. She slapped his shoulders down until they curved into a delicate, feminine line. Every natural movement was a mistake that had to be punished. Then came the assault on his voice. To the Roman elite, a person's status was heard before it was seen. He had to crush the natural resonance rising from his chest. He learned to speak from the highest registers of his throat, imitating the precise musical cadence of the dead Empress Poppaea. He had to copy her laugh, her sighs, and the exact way she pronounced the names of her favorite poets. This was a primitive form of trauma-based identity reconstruction. Calvia drilled him from the first light of dawn until the lamps were extinguished at night. If he stumbled on a single detail of Poppaea's history, she stripped him of sleep. Guards kept him awake for 2 full days using buckets of cold water poured slowly over his skull. Eventually, the human mind cannot endure this level of pressure without fracturing. To survive, the original self retreated into a small, locked room at the back of the skull. The fabricated ghost of Poppaea Sabina stepped forward and took the wheel of the body. The architects had done their job. They had taken a human being and turned him into a living, breathing prosthetic for an emperor's grief. In AD 66, the private nightmare of the Palatine Hill moved out into the blinding light of the Mediterranean sun. Nero decided that his new creation was ready for a global stage. He assembled a floating metropolis of soldiers, administrators, and professional flatterers. They boarded a massive fleet of long-oared galleys at the port of Brundisium. The target was Greece. The emperor wanted to compete in the sacred games, and he wanted his wife at his side to witness his glory. The journey across the sea was a study in surreal power. Sporus sat beneath a heavy canopy of imported linen, shielded from the salt spray and the harsh sun. Slaves moved the air around his face with enormous ostrich plume fans. He wore the long, flowing stola of a Roman matron, the silk heavy with the scent of murex dye. As the fleet anchored at Corinth, the local aristocracy lined the piers. These were men who understood the world of politics and law, yet they lowered their faces to the dust as the mutilated teenager descended the ramp behind the emperor. No one looked up. No one pointed out the biological impossibility of the woman standing before them. The state had declared this person to be the empress, and in the Roman world, the state's word was more real than the truth. The games themselves were a grotesque parody of tradition. The athletic officials were forced to rewrite the holy schedule to accommodate Nero's musical performances. The emperor stood in the dust of the open arena, plucking a 10-stringed lyre and singing Greek tragedies in a voice that strained against the open air. 10,000 citizens packed the stone benches of the amphitheater. They sat for hours under the unrelenting heat, forbidden from leaving. Praetorian soldiers stood at every exit with naked blades. If a citizen fell asleep, their name was recorded. If they stopped clapping, they were marked for execution. The applause that shook the stadium was not born of art. It was born of a mathematical calculation for survival. High in the Imperial viewing box, Sporus watched the spectacle in total silence. Calvia Crispinilla sat directly beside him, her eyes fixed on his posture. She was watching for the slightest masculine twitch, the smallest slip in character. The boy lived in a sensory limbo. He smelled the sweat of the crowds and the smoke of the vendors, but he felt nothing but the weight of the gold collar pressing into the skin of his neck. His silence was the price he paid to keep breathing. The Eastern Tour served a dark purpose. It forced thousands of people to participate in the emperor's delusion. By carving the name Empress Sabina into marble monuments across Greece, the bureaucracy was making the lie permanent. They were building a world where the truth was whatever the man at the top said it was. When the fleet finally turned back toward Italy, the ghost in the flesh had been validated by the provinces. The stage was now set for the ultimate legal trap, a royal wedding in the heart of Rome. The return to Rome was not a homecoming, it was a conquest of reality. Nero declared that the physical resurrection of his wife was complete, but a body is not a person until the law says it is. The private nightmare now required the official signature of the state. The emperor announced a royal wedding, and the vast bureaucracy of Rome, the most complex administrative machine in history, activated to process the impossible. Roman marriage was never about love. It was a cold legal contract designed to transfer wealth and produce heirs. To make Sporus Papia, the state had to rewrite its own rules. Scribes in the imperial offices unrolled fresh sheets of papyrus. They dipped sharpened pens into black ink and drafted the tabulae nuptials, the marriage documents. This paperwork required a formal dowry. To satisfy this, tax revenue squeezed from the grain ships of Egypt was funneled into the private accounts of a fictional bride. The empire was literally paying for its own hallucination. The state religion was the next gear to turn. Roman tradition demanded that the gods be consulted before any union. Priests known as augurs climbed the heights of the Capitoline Hill to watch the flight patterns of birds. They sacrificed young pigs on stone altars and examined the steaming organs for any sign of divine anger. The priests, fully aware that a single word of dissent would mean their execution, publicly declared the omens favorable. They announced that the gods themselves approved of the marriage between a man and a mutilated boy. The bureaucracy filed this divine consent in triplicate. Then came the signatures of men. The contract required 10 witnesses of senatorial rank. 10 of the most powerful men in the world, men who studied philosophy and logic, stepped forward one by one. They pressed their gold signet rings into pools of warm wax. They signed a document verifying a lie. They did not hesitate. Their intelligence was not a shield. It was a tool they used to justify their own cowardice. They convinced themselves that signing the paper was a small price to pay for another day of life. The final requirement was a paterfamilias, a father figure to hand the bride over to the groom. Nero appointed Ophonius Tigellinus, the head of the Praetorian Guard. This was a masterclass in psychological torture. Tigellinus was the man who had helped orchestrate the death of the real Poppaea. Now, he was cast as the doting father of her replacement. He walked into the dressing chamber and looked into the eyes of the boy he knew was a prop. With steady hands, he arranged the flame-orange wedding veil over the boy's head. He tied the sacred knots of the bridal dress with the same precision he used to organize state executions. The ink was dry. The seals were set. The Roman Empire had administratively murdered a boy and legally birthed an empress. The paperwork was finished. Now, all that remained was the performance. The wedding procession moved through the pulsing heart of Rome at sunset. The streets were swept clean by armies of slaves. Saffron-laced incense burned on every corner to mask the chronic stench of the city. Torchbearers led the way through the narrow, crowded alleys, their orange flames dancing against the stone walls. Flute players filled the air with a thin, piercing music, while a choir of young boys raised their voices in traditional wedding chants. Sporus walked at the center of this storm. He was flanked by matrons of honor, the wives of Rome's highest-ranking senators. They held his arms, guiding his artificial, gliding steps over the rough basalt paving stones. Thousands of citizens packed the streets and leaned from rooftop. They showered the procession with lotus blossoms and shouted blessings for the new imperial couple. Many in the crowd knew the truth through the city's whispering gossip networks, but it made no difference. The physical truth of the boy was irrelevant to the machine. The crowd cheered for the symbol the state had ordered them to love. The procession finally reached the Palatine Hill. The massive bronze doors of the banquet hall swung open, revealing the assembled Senate. These were the heirs of the Roman Republic, men who claimed to value dignity and law. Yet, as the bride entered, they rose to their feet as one. They lifted silver goblets and cheered with manufactured ecstasy. They sat on carved ivory couches and watched as Nero fed imported grapes into the mouth of the boy reclining beside him. The feast was a display of obscene wealth. Servants paraded into the hall carrying silver platters of roasted dormice glazed in honey and piles of flamingo tongues. Musicians worked water-powered organs in the corners, the heavy notes vibrating through the floor. The noise was deafening. Nero presided over it all with a look of paternal pride. He had achieved the ultimate victory. He had forced the world to join his hallucination. Then came the exchange of gifts. Nero withdrew a heavy gold ring from a carved box. In Rome, signet rings were instruments of absolute authority. Nero slid the ring onto the boy's finger. The gemstone did not show the goddess of love or marriage. It showed Proserpina, the goddess of the underworld, the queen of the dead who was abducted by Pluto. The symbolism was a cold, public admission. Nero was acknowledging that he was marrying a corpse. He was crowning a queen of shadows. The boy looked down at the ring. The gold was cold against his skin. He understood the image. He knew he had been dragged into a subterranean hell from which no living soul ever returned. He closed his hand into a fist, hiding the face of the goddess. He did not weep. He sat in the center of the wealthiest men on earth, surrounded by luxury, yet he was completely alone. He was a single living object trapped in a room full of ghosts wearing human skin. The illusion appeared to be permanent, but beneath the feet of the dancing courtiers, the foundation stones of the empire were cracking. The provinces were exhausted. The military commanders in Gaul and Spain looked at the imperial accounts and saw only bankruptcy. They saw an emperor singing on stages while the legions went unpaid for months. In AD 68, the rebellion ignited. The Senate, sensing the shifting winds, finally remembered their dignity. They declared Nero a public enemy. The Praetorian Guard abandoned the palace. Nero, the architect of the nightmare, fled to a suburban villa and drove a dagger into his own throat. You might assume that the death of the tyrant meant the freedom of the boy. You would be wrong. In the Roman world, when a master dies, the furniture is simply inherited. Sporus was officially property of the Imperial estate. He had no family, no coin, and no legal identity. He was a piece of equipment left behind in a vacant house. The next year, known to history as the Year of the Four Emperors, saw the boy passed from hand to hand like a cursed relic. First, Nymphidius Sabinus seized him to legitimize his own power. Then, a grim general named Galba locked him in the dark, while the streets of Rome ran red with the blood of executions. In January of AD 69, a man named Otho took the throne. This was a deeper level of horror. Years earlier, Otho had been the husband of the original Poppaea Sabina. He had genuinely loved her before Nero stole her. Now, Otho returned to the palace as its master. He looked at the teenager dressed in his dead wife's clothes. He breathed in her specific perfume. He heard her voice rising from the boy's throat. For Sporus, the pressure became unbearable. He had to perform the role of a wife for a man who actually knew her intimate secret. If he missed a single cadence of her laugh, he reminded the emperor of his greatest loss. Otho embraced the madness, using the boy as a prosthetic limb for his grief. But Otho too fell. The legions of Germany marched on Rome, led by a man named Vitellius. Vitellius was a man of legendary gluttony and casual cruelty. He had no emotional attachment to the ghost of Poppaea. To him, Sporus was a discarded toy, a contaminated symbol of the rulers he had just killed. Vitellius decided that the state had extracted enough political value from this flesh. It was time for entertainment. He sentenced Sporus to the damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the wild beast. The execution was designed as a fatal charade. Vitellius ordered a replica of Hades to be built in the center of the arena. He wanted Sporus dressed as the goddess Proserpina and lashed to a stake. Beneath the white sand, starving lions were kept in the dark, driven into a feral rage. Vitellius wanted the boy to feel the vibration of the trapdoors beneath his feet before the wood splintered open. He wanted the crowd to watch the violent dismemberment of Nero's bride. The guards dragged Sporus to the holding cells beneath the amphitheater. The air reeked of animal waste and rotting meat. Above his head, the citizens of Rome, the same people who had thrown flowers at his wedding, were now cheering for his blood. Sporus sat in the dark. He was 19 years old. Every decision in his life had been made by powerful men. A merchant erased his past. A surgeon erased his sect. An emperor erased his name. In that cold stone cell, Sporus looked around. He found a tool. He did not wait for the guards. He did not walk out onto the sand to be a prop for the mob. He severed his own mortal thread. When the guards finally opened the door to retrieve their star actor, they found only a corpse. This was not a defeat. It was the first and only act of absolute sovereignty in his entire life. By taking his own breath, Sporus stole the finale from the Empire. He denied the mob their show and denied the Emperor his victory. He died as the master of his own ending, leaving the Roman machine with nothing but an empty stage and a quiet cell. If you enjoy dark, untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.